Hello everybody, my name is Zeke. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about some summer book recommendations. Now, the books I've picked out for this are definitely a very mixed bag. I tried to keep it very loose, keep it very sprawling, so there's a lot of different options for kind of anyone who wants to read anything. There's some shorter things in here, there's some longer things in here. There's definitely a wide variety of genres. Because it is so broad, and I tried to keep it broad on purpose, there is a lot of variation in my reasoning of why I'm calling something a summer book recommendation, but I did kind of actually have some criteria. So a lot of these books, they either remind me of summer for whatever reason, which I'll explain when I get to them, or I think they are good for reading in summer. And so I think, yes, that's a little loose, but also I did have some rationale behind my picks, and I think I chose a lot of good options, as you will soon see. So lock in, get ready to add some things to your TBR, and I hope that you enjoy learning about some of these amazing books that you should definitely read. So the first book I'm going to recommend, I absolutely love, don't get me wrong, but I kind of just have to get it out of the way because, I mean, everyone knows about this book by this point for the most part, and that's My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. This is everywhere, everyone loves this, including myself. This is the first book in a 4-book series called The Neapolitan Novels by Elena Ferrante, and I would consider this probably like one of my favorite series ever. Definitely my favorite like literary fiction, non-fantasy sci-fi series ever. Absolutely incredible. But what it's actually about is we're following the entire lives basically of these two girls who we meet in this first book, who form a very complicated friendship in a kind of poorer community in Naples in Italy, and they grow up together. They branch out in very different directions in their lives through their various immediate circumstances, and kind of go through very different pathways, but always end up in each other's lives in very complicated ways. So yes, they are friends, but especially as we get into later books and they have so much backstory and so much past together, we really see how their friendship has warped and changed based on the different directions their lives have gone in. And I think by the end of the book, we just have such a complex portrait of these two characters, and definitely one of the most interesting, most nuanced relationships I've ever read about in a book ever. And it all starts with this amazing book. The writing, absolutely beautiful, definitely makes it. Obviously the characters, as I said, but even I would say, I think this first book is a little looser on plot, and I think it mainly focuses on these characters. There's still stuff going on, but I think especially after you get through this first book and you really grow to know the characters so well, you get really invested in the plot. I think by the second and third book, I was flying through these. I was just so interested not just in like the characters, but in what was going to happen next, because I think actually reading about their lives is very interesting. It goes beyond just their relationships. There's more going on. There's a lot of political intrigue. There's a lot of commentary on class and family. There's actually just so much that this book and this whole series does well, and I've only touched on like a tiny portion of it, but it's also just a summer book to me because it just feels very summery while you're reading it. You can really lounge about in this world with these characters. It feels like, especially this first book, like snapshots of like young childhood summers where you're just kind of running around, you don't have any responsibilities, and you're just kind of building relationships. And so I also, to be completely transparent, read most of the series during summer, so it definitely like spurs a lot of summer memories for me. But I think even regardless of that, these books, just with their flowery writing and the way they let you sit in these characters, just really scream summer to me. So the next book I'm going to talk about, I would classify as a summer book for very different reasons, and that's Eve's Hollywood by Eve Babbitt. Ignore the tabs. I was a little delusional when I put them in there. I've never referenced them in my life. I don't even know what I would find if I went to them. But this book is obviously written by Eve Babbitt. Her name is in the title, and it is about Eve's Hollywood. In this book, we basically get a lot of vignettes from her life. They're semi-fictionalized, is my understanding of it. I always get a little confused because they seem so real. They seem very memoir-y, and they are very memoir-y, but I think there's like some of it that's not necessarily 100% true, but definitely feel very real. And through this book we just get this like portrait of this woman and her life in Hollywood, her growing up there, and then as she got older, more experiences that she had. It's hard to kind of summarize because it's a lot of vignettes, but I think that's what makes it such a good summer read. Is I think you get this like fast-paced moving through these different stories, and you can pick this up on the beach and read a few and then put it down and kind of come back to it whenever you have the time or the urge to read. And I just think also just the character of this book, this kind of freewheeling, very loose, wide-ranging set of vignettes we get in here just really feel very summer to me because of how much freedom you have during the summer usually, or the more freedom you feel during the summer, and how it really feels like anything can happen. And I think that this book really conveys that kind of feeling as well. Next, I chose kind of for similar reasons, but it's a very different book, and that's If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. I've actually read this a while ago, but it's really stuck with me, and I actually want to reread this. I say that about a lot of books. I need to actually follow through with that, but this is definitely one of them. This is another book that I feel like is very fast paced, and you get deep within these characters and like little vignettes of their lives, but at the same time it has a little bit deeper messaging than something like Eve's Hollywood. In this book, we are following a bunch, I think it's 4 women who live in the same apartment building. I think 2 of them are roommates, one lives across the hall, and one is kind of a little separate from that kind of group, but we're kind of switching between their perspectives, learning about their lives in Seoul, in Korea, and they're all in different stages of their lives, but they are all kind of united by the fact that they live in this building, and some of them become friends. They are often in contact with each other, and they are all going through pretty tough times for various reasons, but there's a lot of conversations in here about beauty standards and obviously friendship. These women are in strained relationships with others. They have strained relationships between each other, and it's just kind of a whole complicated mess of people being people, and people being complicated, and people having very hard times coming to terms with their place in the world and their place in relationships. And I just think that this book executes exploring those relationships so well within kind of a pretty short time frame. I think I consider this a very summer book because, as I said, very similar reasons as Eve's Hollywood. It's kind of fast-paced. You have this sense of like excitement and freedom around everything that's happening, but at the same time, this is a much darker book, and the lives of these characters are much darker, and there's some scenes in here which I think are pretty difficult to read. So I definitely say yes, summer recommendation, but with the caveat that this is definitely a little bit of a darker summer recommendation. Speaking of darker summer recommendations, I have another one, and this one is really dark, and that's Tender as the Flesh by Agostina Basterrica. This is a very, very short horror book about cannibalism, basically. In this world, there is this like special class of people that are specifically bred and kept in confinement and mutilated to kind of raise them up as meat for the rest of the population to eat. And this is all done because there was a disease that kind of made all other meat not consumable by humankind. And in this book, we're following one man and his place in the world. He's kind of involved in this industry. He's not like super high up in it. He's not orchestrating all of the horrors, but he's definitely very involved. We see a lot of this world through his eyes. We see a lot of the horrors of this world through his eyes. The actual story and plot of this book is kind of ignited when he comes into contact with a woman who has been bred as meat and has to form a relationship with her outside of her intended purpose, and I'll keep that vague. And from there, it gets it starts out very dark and it stays dark throughout, and then the end, we like really fall off the deep end. And I would call this a summer recommendation because personally, I don't read a lot of horror, but I think there's something about reading really like disturbing books like this in the summer that just captivates me. I think there's kind of a dissonance in a way between like reading something like this outside when it's warm out when everything seems kind of nice and bright, and then you come in and you read this book and it kind of brings you to a whole different place. I also think there just is an intrinsic relationship between summer and horror. For whatever reason, in my mind, I think like there's like a lot of like gothic horror like tropes that revolve around summer. I don't think my reasoning for this one is particularly good, but I would still definitely recommend this. Even if my reasoning might not be the absolute best, I do think this is just a really good horror book that kind of fits some of how I think about the books I want to read in the summer and what kind of the summer atmosphere can create for me when I'm reading horror books. I think this is just a good example of that. And I just highly recommend it, even outside of summer, go ahead and read it. Next, I have a very recent book read that I'm very glad I read because it became probably my favorite book I've read so far this year, or at least very high up there. And that's The Guest by Emma Cline. In this book, we're following this woman who has fled New York City out to Long Island to go live with a wealthy man. And she has done this because she's kind of in a sticky situation back in New York, and she's trying to kind of flee that and also just live the best life that she can out in this new place. But she's kind of untethered. She doesn't have a lot of connection to anything, and she ends up having to leave and go on kind of a subversive hero's journey type quest through this area when things kind of go south with the man that she is staying with very quick, and we realize just how precarious her situation is. This is a summer book to me because not only does it take place in the summer, but it kind of gets to kind of the darker undertones of some of like the more beachy summer experience, atmosphere, whatever you want to call it. I think that this book, this woman we're following, she's a very unlikable character. She doesn't have a lot of regard or any regard for anyone she meets, and she just kind of lives for herself. She's trying to just get through this time and keep herself afloat without regard for what all the harm she's causing to the other people she meets throughout this whole entire journey that she goes on. We see kind of the undersides of the wealthy people that she meets and the darker sides of the lives that they lead. And we see it all through her perspective as this kind of outsider who doesn't even necessarily want to be an insider, but is kind of in this in-between space where she's using all these people to stay alive and get what she wants. And I just think it's a very interesting perspective, very summary book because of that, but once again, like a more like subversive, darker summary book that still has a lot of summer flair to it. But I like my books darker in the summer. If you haven't noticed, I don't think that just because it's summer everything should be light and fluffy, because everything is not light and fluffy. So I definitely say this is probably like the most directly like summer book because it literally takes place in the summer. A lot of this is her walking around outside and spending time on the beach, but the circumstances of all that are still darker, and so definitely appeals to me because I like that kind of book. But also this book is very minimal on the actual plot. We kind of have the whole plot drawn out for us at the beginning when we find out what she's going to be doing, and it's really just about seeing this world through her eyes and the people she meets and her character, which is just a fascinating mind space to occupy for however long this book is, and I really loved it. But it's also not for everyone because it is very slow and she's incredibly unlikable, so definitely go in wary. But if any of that sounded interesting, I would definitely recommend at least picking it up. Okay, next I have another darker book, but this is a children's Bible by Lydia Millet. I had to check the author real quick. This is a book it's a dystopian book, and it starts with a bunch of kids and adults, a bunch of different families living in this house when all of a sudden a catastrophic storm comes and rips everything apart and throws everything into disarray and starts kind of the dystopian leg of this book. This book is, once again, it kind of takes place in summer. It's like this vacation house. I think within this book, another aspect of it that really screams summer to me is this like haze we're viewing everything through. It's very kind of loosely narrated. The events feel very hazy just with the way it's written, and all the children I love the way they're written. They're very like insightful in almost a creepy way, and in that way that like little kids can sometimes say things that seem like they catch on to things that like older people just don't see in a very unsettling way. And I think this book it has a lot of that, and it just really reminds me of that feeling. And to me, like, that kind of hazy feeling is very that darker underside of summer. The kids in this book are very mature. They're kind of, we see them kind of take control of the whole situation, and while the adults are basically panicking and being stupid the whole time, which is like a fun subversion of expectations, honestly, and it's very eerie and kind of creepy. But also, I just think this is a very different dystopian book. It is not immediately satisfying. It's not action-packed. There's action that happens, but that's not the main point of this book. It feels very plausible because of how this storm kind of starts and where everything goes, and while still having these kind of, they're not supernatural-esque vibes throughout. And I really just loved all the atmosphere building that happened in this book, and I would highly recommend. 2 more to go, starting with A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. This one I don't have a really good reasoning for, but I will explain this book and then get into my feelings on it. So in this book, we are following a kind of self-insert character of Ruth, which is the author's name, who discovers basically a diary in a bottle of this girl back in Japan who has written this like crazy long narrative of her life, and why she's decided to commit suicide. And what comes from there is this really just strange book, but also captivating book. We have another like child perspective that seems eerily mature, and also we have this whole like background narrative of Ruth reading the story, and Ruth is a writer who wants to kind of write about everything that's happening. And then the little girl's diary, she's once again very insightful, but experiencing awful things and just going through a lot. Once again, a lot of this book is kind of hazy. We have that like separation between author and character, what's real, what's not, and there's like some very, very, very strange sequences in here, especially towards the end, that are very confusing and very hazy and kind of supernaturally tinged. And that kind of reminds me of that like summer haze feeling I was talking about. I also did read this on the beach, in my own kind of summer haze near the end of summer. And I think just that the time I read this, like getting ready for summer to end, and also just kind of the very strange happenings in this book and the atmosphere that's built through those strange happenings, is all kind of blended together in my mind, and made this a very summery book for me. But once again, that kind of darker, disturbing side of summer. But I really like this book. My feelings on this have never been concrete. There's like some things in here where I definitely am like, yeah, I don't love Ruth's perspective nearly as much as I love reading the girl's perspective. I just don't think it's as interesting. It kind of takes you out of the story sometimes, but at the same time, I think the messages that you eventually get out of the story and the way she's able to weave everything together through the end is just so impressive that I think I ended up giving this 5 stars, and I really think that this really defined that summer for me. And so it's kind of a very personal reason for this being a summer recommendation, but I hope, especially as we are kind of in the end of summer territory, this can serve as a unsettling reminder of that for some people if they decide to pick this up. The last book I'm going to talk about is a very big book, both plot-wise, page-wise, and thematically, and that's East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This is not a light endeavor, and that's one of the reasons that I would consider it a summer recommendation. It's about 600 pages. No one has the time for that, and it's dense pages. Outside of summer, like time to actually just sit down and read that and be fully engaged, I never have time like that. And so I read this in the summer, and I think a lot of people, if you have more time in the summer, this is a great time to read a book like this. And I'll get into my other reason after I actually try to explain what this is about. It's a sweeping story that covers generations of 2 families, really, the Hamiltons and the Trasks, I think. Yeah, and I forgot the last names, it's been a while. And we're following these different generations and their relationships with, like, their familial relationships and their relationships with each other, between these 2 families, and also their marriages and their like business operations and and the farming things and everything that's going on in their lives. And at the same time, all this whole story is backdropped by kind of the story of Cain and Abel from the Bible. And so there's all these biblical references throughout. So there's a lot going on, and it spans decades upon decades, and we get all this backstory, and we get all of this like progression through like literally 3 generations of this, especially the Trask family's lives. And very central to everything that happens in the story for the most part is the Salinas Valley. The book literally starts with like pages upon pages of descriptions of the landscape, and that continues throughout, though not to the same extent. But I think all like that description of landscape and the way that the land is incorporated into the story really just screams summer to me, because I just associate like descriptions of landscape like that and like working the land with the summer. And so this is definitely a summer book to me, because of the length and because of kind of that motif and that thematic through line we have throughout. And the land kind of is a reference to some of the other themes within the book, like the difference between good and evil, and is like directly reflected in these descriptions of the land in a very interesting and powerful way, and really foreshadowed from the beginning of the book. I really do love this book. I really need to reread this. This is like really top priority, even though summer's almost over and I'm definitely not getting to it this summer, but definitely need to revisit this because it's been a while and I just really loved this when I read it, and I hope that you will love this when you read this as well, because there's just a lot to love. I just think the themes are explored in very interesting ways through these characters that we really hate in some cases, but also in other cases we've just seen their whole lives and we feel like we understand them so well. All that to really just say it's an incredible reading experience that I think is only amplified by reading it in the summer, and I really hope that my description, however loose and unhelpful it may have been, may have encouraged you to pick it up yourself. So that's gonna do it for this video. Those are all my summer book recommendations for the rest of the summer. We have a little chunk left, and even if you don't get to them this summer, hopefully next summer this will serve as something you can go back to and reference, or even just read them throughout the year. That's okay too. And I really hope that you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. If you did, please feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe if you want, and I will see you in the next one.